This little robot was one of Nintendo's worst products. It got discontinued after just 2 games, but it also saved the gaming industry. And even after 20 years, people still don't know that R.O.B was used as a Trojan horse to save the gaming industry literally from the landfills. You see, after the smash hit of their new Donkey Kong arcade cabinets and the success of the Famicom system in Japan, a young Nintendo of America was looking to expand into the home video game market inside the US. But there was just one problem here, because in the early 80s, Atari was the king of the hill in home video gaming, and they were in control of over 80% of the entire market. During their boom, consumer demand was so high that people were waiting for months just to get their hands on their most famous console, the Atari 2600. People were going absolutely crazy, buying just about any type of video game that came from Atari, to the point where Atari couldn't produce them fast enough to keep up with demand. So what they did as a response is that they started handing out licensing to other companies, so that way they could make games for the Atari console instead. And well, that unfortunately backfired for Atari, because they got a little too overconfident with their dominance, and suddenly a bunch of low-quality games started flooding the market, since Atari wasn't doing any sort of quality control for these third-party games that were being made. A lot of them were just quick, terribly made cash grabs that kept disappointing consumers over and over again. The most famous case was the video game E.T., which is known today as the worst video game ever made. Atari completely crashed the video game market in 1983, and they ended up with such a huge oversupply of bad games in their warehouses that they took a bunch of their extra stock, including thousands of copies of E.T., and just buried all of it in a local landfill located in New Mexico. At this point, the video game industry in North America was as good as dead. Critics were calling it a passing fad, but that wasn't about to stop Nintendo from trying to enter the market, because back home in Japan, their Famicom system was actually a huge success. It was the best-selling game console in Japan at the time, and they were sure that the US was going to love it, so they had to get a little creative. Because retailers didn't want anything to do with the gaming industry, to the point that they were refusing to put new systems on their shelves because of the huge loss in profits that video games had cost. It was here that Nintendo crafted such a devious plan to revitalize the industry that to this day it's known as one of the most smartest moves in gaming history. This is R.O.B. You probably only know him from the Super Smash Bros. Series, but he was a toy robot that Nintendo launched all the way back in July of 1985. The Robotic Operating Buddy, or R.O.B, was an accessory to the NES console where you could plug him in like a second controller, and he would use the lenses in his eyes to register what was happening in your monitor, to pick up and move a spinning gyro to press buttons and basically play the game with you. It was the same type of sensor that Nintendo used in their Zapper gun with their famous game Duck Hunt, and they all came together in the deluxe set that Nintendo was trying to sell in the American market. The only problem here is that there were only 2 games ever made for R.O.B, and they were both considered to be pretty terrible. The first game that came with the deluxe set was called Gyromite, and it was a puzzle platformer where the main character, called Professor Hector, had to collect dynamite before time runs out, and R.O.B would place a gyro on either the red or the blue button to move the pillars in the game and help you move basically. And Stack Up was all about making R.O.B match the block stacks it had with the ones that were being shown on screen. Overall, the games really weren't too good, and the main complaints were that R.O.B was really slow when it came to performing actions. It was like watching paint dry on your screen, and that R.O.B was going through batteries like crazy. So when people found out that you could just plug in a regular second controller and use that to press the buttons instead of using R.O.B, well, R.O.B was kind of just pushed aside afterwards. And believe it or not, that's exactly what Nintendo was hoping you would do. Now you might be thinking, how did such a bad game design end up being the savior of the gaming industry, and why would Nintendo purposely want people to forget about R.O.B? Well, this is where the Nintendo magic starts to kick in, because when Nintendo presented the American version of the Famicom at the Consumer Electronics Show of 1985, they rebranded it as the Nintendo Entertainment System. They purposely designed it to avoid resembling a game console. Their game cartridges were side-loaded instead of being top-loaded like the Atari consoles, and they even tried not to use terms like video games when it came to presenting their new system. And thanks to some brilliant marketing, Nintendo was tricking people into thinking that R.O.B was the centerpiece toy of their deluxe set, not the NES console or the Zapper that came along with it. It was all about R.O.B. There was a huge push from Nintendo to sell the idea that R.O.B was the world's first and only interactive robot, and any advertisement you would see on TV from Nintendo would have you believe that R.O.B was the heart of the system, and that just casually happened to include a NES console on the side. You know, no big deal, it just happened to be there. And this is where Nintendo used a Trojan horse strategy to sneak their NES console into the American homes, because Nintendo was convinced that once they managed to get people to buy their game consoles using R.O.B as the main selling point, the rest would honestly just be easy, because their video game technology was light years ahead of what anybody had seen with the Atari 2600. And because of the design language that they used with the deluxe set, Nintendo had it labeled as a toy instead of a video game, so when it came time to talk to retailers and investors about selling their bundle on American stores, they weren't really selling video games, because that's in the past. Nobody wants video games. We don't do that anymore. No, Nintendo was all about selling R.O.B, the futuristic robot toy that could bypass the negative stigma video games had from the crashed market, and they managed to get it to sell next to other robot toys like Transformers, instead of being placed in the discount bin next to all the other dead Atari consoles at the time. This was a 9,000 IQ move from Nintendo, a checkmate in just 4 moves, because that managed to save the North American gaming industry, and people were rushing to the stores to buy the deluxe set for R.O.B, thinking it would be like a Transformers toy / entertainment system. Now for contrast, in the 1980s, the gaming industry was pretty much dead in the water. Meanwhile, the toy industry was doing pretty strong, especially with Transformers being one of the most popular IPs at the time, so the fact that people were comparing R.O.B to the Transformers IP was just extra icing on the cake. But once the consumers actually managed to get their hands on it, they realized that the NES console that R.O.B came with was way more fun to play with than the toy itself. And once the NES consoles managed to find their way into the hands of the consumers, that was game over, because that's when Nintendo decided to kick their video game sales into overdrive, and that sparked a renewed interest in gaming and gave retailers enough reasons to want to start putting video games back on their shelves. And Nintendo was in the front and center of the newly revived gaming industry, and they were coming out with bangers like Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and to avoid another crisis like the Atari video game crash of 1983, and to make sure that consumers could trust that the games that were coming from Nintendo were actually of good quality, Nintendo started putting their official seal of approval on games that were certified to be absolute bangers, so that people could make sure that they weren't getting their hands on just another E.T. the video game. This was the opportunity Nintendo was looking for, and in just a matter of months, they managed to not only bring the video game market back to life by using R.O.B as a decoy, but they were also practically controlling the entire market, because at that point, everybody was talking about Nintendo, and then everybody wanted to get their hands on an NES console. So in the following years that came afterwards, R.O.B really didn't receive any more games or updates like how it was promised in the advertising. Meanwhile, the NES console continued to sell way more copies as just the control deck in Super Mario Bros. Instead of people buying the entire deluxe set. And with the library of NES video games exploding with a bunch of popular hit titles, R.O.B at this point had completed its purpose in getting people interested in buying Nintendo products, and after that it was just completely forgotten about. So R.O.B and the 2 games that were made for it were just quietly discontinued by Nintendo a few years later. Now if we talk about R.O.B in the present day, every now and then you'll see him pop up in some sort of cameo inside of Nintendo's games, like in Mario Kart or in Super Smash Bros., and he's actually a very plot-relevant character inside the Subspace Emissary, which is a story mode for Super Smash Bros. Brawl, but for the most part he's a very important piece of lore inside the gaming industry that is often overlooked, even though he sits pretty comfortably inside the Nintendo World Store inside New York City, where they have him up for display alongside the entire deluxe set for the Nintendo NES console. And even though these days this cute little robot is more of a paperweight or a conversation starter than anything else, it's still a pretty awesome reminder of how Nintendo used a Trojan horse to bring a dead gaming industry back to life.